welcome to the AP World History Podcast. This is episode 16, European Transformations in the Early Modern Era. The primary focus of this episode will be on Western Europe and the changes that happened within Europe between the years 1450 and 1750. So in the post-classical period, we saw a break in Christianity between the Catholics in Western Europe and the Orthodox Christians of the Byzantine Empire in Russia. The period 1450 to 1750 is called the Early Modern Period or the Early Modern Era. And it's in this early modern period that we see another fundamental break in Christianity, specifically on the Catholic side. So we're going to be talking about that in this podcast. The second part of the podcast will briefly look at the philosophical and technological advancements that occurred in Europe during this time period that have collectively come to be known as the Scientific Revolution and later the Enlightenment. So we're talking about European transformations in the early modern era, and a good place to start is with the religious thinker and teacher Martin Luther. Luther was born in 1483. He was German. He was a priest and teacher who taught religion at a university in Wittenberg. Legend has it that he decided to devote his life to religion because of a near-death experience where he was just about struck by lightning and narrowly escaped death. While he was teaching religion at Wittenberg, Luther became more and more critical of some of the things that the Catholic Church was doing, and over time he came to view the church as being corrupt and misinterpreting the true meaning of Christianity. And it's really a combination of practices by the church that made Luther upset, but one thing in particular stands out, and that's the selling of what's called an indulgence. And the selling of indulgences is often put forward as a key reason for the reformation of the church, because I think it sort of encapsulates some of the corruption that existed in the church at that time. So, just some background, in the 16th century, the Catholic Church was undergoing all types of efforts to raise money for monumental building projects. One of these building projects was St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So for those of you that have been to Rome and been to the Vatican, you can imagine how much wealth would be needed to build and maintain a place like that. So the Catholic Church were always trying to find new ways of collecting more money, and the selling of indulgences were one of the things that the Catholic Church did to raise money. So before we can understand the concept of indulgences, we need to understand the concept of purgatory. Now the Catholic Church taught that purgatory was a place between heaven and hell that people went to after dying, and depending on how you lived your life, you would have to spend a certain amount of time in purgatory before gaining acceptance into heaven. And you could very well wind up spending eternity in purgatory. So the church sold these indulgences to people basically in exchange for money. The time you spent in purgatory would be shortened or eliminated. So you bought these indulgences, and these indulgences meant that the time spent in purgatory would be lessened or would be eliminated. So in effect, you could essentially buy your way into heaven by giving money to the church. And for Luther, this concept was totally absurd. He argued there's nothing in the Bible that said anything about purgatory, and this was just something that the Catholic Church made up in order to raise money for the church. The example of indulgences is usually given as the reason why Luther broke from the church, but really there were a lot of things that Martin Luther had a problem with. One key issue where Luther differed from the church was concerning who made it to heaven. The church taught followers that people made it into heaven by going to church, performing the church sacraments, and by doing good things with their time on earth. What Luther took away from the Bible was that simply believing in God was enough to get into heaven, and a lot of what the church did were meaningless and didn't have anything to do with salvation. So, in a lot of ways, the church was really an unnecessary obstacle between an individual and heaven. So according to Luther, the source of religious authority needed to come from the Bible, and people needed to interpret the Bible for themselves If the church was doing all the interpreting for people, they were essentially standing in between people and the Bible. By the year 1517, Martin Luther was totally fed up with the church, and he compiled this long list of complaints against the church, which are known as the 95 Theses. Legend has it that he marched up to the doors of the church in Wittenberg and hammered the 95 Theses to the door. 2 copies, one in Latin, which was the language of the church, and one in German, which was the language of the people. Whether this actually happened this way is up for debate, but either way, he submitted his complaints to the church, he made his complaints known to the church, and his ideas became well known because he was teaching them to his students. So, Luther had all these problems with the church, but he was still invested in the church. He had devoted his whole life to the Catholic Church, and from his perspective, he was trying to make it better. He was hoping his complaints would be received and would lead to debate within the church and bring about reform. So he initially wasn't trying to start a new church, he was just trying to reform the Catholic Church. For their part, the Catholic Church didn't take kindly at all to Luther's criticisms, and they kicked him out of the church. They excommunicated him, and they banned all of his writing. But unfortunately for the church, by the time they kicked Luther out, his ideas had already spread and they'd become popular with some local princes in Germany. And these princes wanted more independence from the Catholic Church, so it comes back to that struggle between monarchs and the church in Europe over who is the real power. So, specifically in German territories in the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, remember, it's centered in Italy and Rome, so there's this tension between rulers and monarchs with the church. People in Germany don't necessarily see the Pope and Rome as representing their interests. So some rulers saw in Luther's ideas maybe a way to gain more political independence from Rome, from the church. So Luther, despite being kicked out of the church, continued to teach and continued to write. He translated the Latin Bible into German so everybody in Germany would be able to read it. And when it became clear to him that the Catholic Church was not going to budge and they're not going to change on account of his criticisms, he decided, forget it, I'll make my own church in protest of the Catholic Church. So, protesting the Catholic Church, you have the emergence of Protestantism in Europe. And this is a major, big picture concept because it's a permanent divide in Christianity in Western Europe. And over time, a number of different Protestant faiths would emerge, but Luther's was the first, and people who followed his religion became known as Lutherans. Okay, so just a quick snapshot. How did the Protestant faith differ from the Catholic faith? Salvation is obtained through faith alone, not through good deeds. Religious truth and authority can only be found in the Bible, not in the Pope. All jobs are important, not just the occupations of priests, monks, nuns, clergy. Worship service should be in the language of the people so that they understand what they're being preached. And there are only 2 sacraments, baptism and marriage.